Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Alan Fromhertz, and I'm the director of the Middle East Study Center at Georgia State University. And I'm very happy to welcome you to our first major event of the year and our first event on Zoom, actually. So this is an inaugural occasion. I want to first thank everyone who has made this event possible, including Diana Rapp, who can be seen here on Zoom. She's my co-host and the person who's helping out with this lecture. She also did the wonderful poster that you see in front of you. And I want to thank all of our wonderful co-sponsors, including Duke and UNC. So everyone from Duke, UNC, welcome. Welcome to Georgia State. And we're very happy to have your cooperation in this event, as well as, of course, Emory, Aleph, and everyone else who has contributed. I'm very happy and pleased to introduce to you today my wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Cooperson. And he has come out with this incredible volume, right? The Impostures, which I have here in front of me. It even has 2 ribbons so you can find your place in multiple locations. It's a beautiful volume. And it is what I would consider the greatest so far of the translations that I've seen of Al-Hariri, because it does more than just translate. It allows for the context and the feel of the book itself to come alive. So we are very pleased to have Michael Cooperson. He is professor of Arabic at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he teaches pre-modern Arabic literature, as well as courses on translation from Arabic to English. He is the translator of Ibn al-Jawzi's Virtues of the Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal from 2013, which received the Sheikh Hamad Prize for Translation and International Understanding, and has been reissued as The Life of Ibn Hanbal in 2017. His most recent translation, Impostures, and I recommend it, an Englishing of the Maqamat of Al-Hariri. His research interests include early Abbasid cultural history and Maltese language and culture. So please join me in welcoming Michael Cooperson. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Professor Fromhertz. Thank you to GSU and to all the sponsors of the event. I also want to thank another important entity for us, which is New York University, Abu Dhabi, which is where Professor Fromhertz and I first met. He was working on a history of the Gulf, which I hear is going through the editorial process, and I hope to see it soon. So I haven't read it. What I have read, however, is his book on Ibn Khaldun, which is fantastic. So if the Gulf book is as good as that book, then that too will be fantastic. So I urge all of you to rush out and read both of them. So congratulations, I guess, in advance on the appearance of the Gulf history. But what brings us here is what I was working on there, which is the translation that Professor Fromhertz so kindly mentioned. And it's relatively new. It just came out a few months ago. And I'm not sure who's here. I don't know who is here, but I want to make sure to thank a few people. Shaukat Turawa is the person who should be credited with the translation. As those of you know who are at all familiar with Arabic and with the term maqama in Arabic, it's very hard to translate. And Shaukat suggested Impostures, which I think, I hope to persuade you by the end, is a very, very good translation. I'd also like to thank Haif Kahraman, who did this fantastic cover art, which is based on 13th century illustrations of the same book, although she has a kind of Japanese twist to it. And finally, I don't know if he's here, but Devin Stewart from Emory was the editor of the original Arabic edition of this text that the translation is of. And he corrected many of my errors and added lots of good information to the notes. So if the book has any virtue, a good deal of it has to do with the work of other people. I've always told anyone who asks, and my students, that translation is always a collective endeavor, and so is publishing. And so as I go through, you'll see me thank a lot of people, and I really feel that this is an important part of producing this kind of work, that we acknowledge all of the collective effort that went into it. Now, I've given several talks already on this book as a translation, so how I dealt with the Arabic. And I'm happy to talk about that and answer any questions about it at any time. But I'm really glad actually that Alan asked me to do something different today, which is to talk about this work as a source of knowledge about the past. So what can we learn from this particular work of Arabic literature about the past, which is a question that people, I think, have answered in ways that have not always been productive. So I'd like to try something new. But before we go to that, I want to actually tell you about what this is for those who may not be familiar. So the author is a man called Al-Hariri, and we see him here on the cover of a modern biography. He lived most of his life in the Iraqi town of Basra, which you see in the background picture, although obviously from a much later period. What you see him doing on the cover picture is pulling at his beard. And the reason he was doing that is that he had set himself what he thought was an impossible task, which is to write 50 maqamat. Now, we'll get in a moment to what a maqama is, but he found doing it extremely intimidating and terrifying and difficult. And so what he would do is write and cross out and write and cross out and his beard the entire time. And his biographers say that by the time he finished, he had actually ripped out his beard. Now, if you survey my appearance, you will note that I also seem to be someone who's pulled his hair out over something. And in fact, as a translator, having to replicate what Al-Hariri did put me in very much the same position that he himself was in, trying to write 50 very difficult pieces of literature. But what is a maqama and why is it difficult? That's the next question. Well, I'm not going to answer that question for all times and languages because maqama, the term maqama means many things. But in the context of Al-Hariri, it is basically a short story that uses the adventures of a hard-drinking preacher named Abu Zaid. And here you see Abu Zaid on the left preaching. And there's Abu Zaid on the right drinking. To illustrate the complexities of the Arabic language. So what a maqama intends to do is to show off what Arabic can do, as our colleague Jenny Miller puts it. It rhymes from beginning to end, either the prose rhymes or the verses rhyme. So there's both prose and verse that rhyme. There are references to scripture, to the Quran, to the hadith of the Prophet, to Arabic legend and lore, to poetry, to the whole corpus of antecedent literature in Arabic. And finally, there are word games, riddles, puns, palindromes, lipograms, and other forms of wordplay and constrained writing. Palindrome is the same forwards and backwards, and a lipogram is a text where you're not allowed to use certain letters. So as an example, here is Abu Zaid preaching in the mosque. And if you look at the text above him, which is the sermon that he's actually preaching, you will see, I'm just going to read a little bit of this so you can hear it. So you're going to hear a rhythm and then a switch to a different rhythm and lots of rhyme, internal prose rhyme. So and just the first few words are missing, but it doesn't matter for this purpose. للإسلام ممهدا وللملة موطدا ولأدلة الرسل مؤكدا وللأسود والأحمر مسددا وصل الأرحام وعلم الأحكام ووسم الحلال والحرام ورسم الإحلال والإحرام. So that is an example of the kind of rhyme and rhythm that go through all 50 of the texts. But what you may not have noticed is that, so if you know Arabic, you know that about half the letters have dots and about half don't. This particular sermon is preached from beginning to end with no dots at all. It's not something you would necessarily notice as you were listening. And the whole trick is to do it so it sounds natural, which I think he does. So this is just simply one of the kinds of word games that Al-Hariri plays in the Maqamat. Now, for this kind of wordplay to be impressive, you need an audience. And Wasati, the painter who illustrated the Maqamat, excels in depicting the audience. In the text itself, our narrator, who was also the kind of starstruck sidekick of Abu Zaid, is this man here, Al-Harith bin Hammam, whose name means something like everyman, or as Joe Biden, my state senator, used to say, Joe Sixpack. I know that's culturally inappropriate, but it gives you some sense of who Al-Harith is supposed to be culturally. And his job in the text is to travel from one city to another within the broader Islamic community. And everywhere he goes, he finds this eloquent preacher whom he never recognizes at first, but who then comes up with some brilliant specimen of wordplay, to which the response is some very long and rhymed version of wow. Now, the idea that the Maqamat are about learning something is something that Al-Hariri says himself. He says, I wrote these stories because I know they're fiction and I know they talk about reprehensible things like drinking and so on, but he doesn't quite mention that, but he says reprehensible things without specifying. And there are things that were controversial. There's quite a bit of drinking, a lot of same-sex eroticism, a lot of raunchiness and vulgarity. But he says the point of it all was to teach people the complexities of the Arabic language. And in effect, he needed to explore all these different dimensions of human experience to be able to show off all the things that Arabic can do. Now, the extent to which the Maqamat are about learning is the focus of a really good dissertation by Matthew Keegan, who is at Columbia. And he makes the argument that, among other things, that the difficulty of the Maqamat is intended to train readers in the interpretation of challenging texts, first and foremost, the Quran. And I think that Matthew makes an excellent case for why that makes sense. It's a very plausible reading of one of the things that the text can do. Now, I'm interested in a slightly different dimension of that learning, which is to try and bring the Maqamat into conversation with something that we know, an extraordinary phenomenon that we know was happening all around Al-Hariri, which was the expansion of Arabic, the Arabization of Southwest Asia. And this map is actually a map of the expansion of Islam, which is related, but not the same thing. But what I like about it are the arrows, which gives you a very vivid sense that Arabic begins in the western part of the peninsula. It then expands, in some cases actually leading eventually to the disappearance of local languages like Coptic in Egypt, or Syriac or Aramaean, Neo-Aramaic in Syria and Iraq, and in other places existing as the language of literacy, of government, of culture, of religion, as a minority elite language in a world where everybody spoke something else. So in Iran, it would have been Iranian languages. In North Africa, it would have been Amazigh languages, and so on. Now, what scholars don't know very much about is how Arabic was actually learned. So one of the ways that I think we can approach this is to look at what it is that Arabic learners thought they were doing when they were learning Arabic. And I think it's useful to think comparatively with modern English as a global language, where it's not entirely clear that people are learning it voluntarily or involuntarily. It's a more complex set of motivations than that. So if one looks at, for example, a relatively minor language like Maltese, for example, which is gradually giving way to English in Malta, it's not necessarily because English is forcing itself as a dominant language at the expense of Maltese, but that Maltese people with mixed feelings, are teaching it to their children. When they set up universities and colleges and training programs, most of that is in English. And so it's a combination of push and pull that's really quite complex. So global languages are interesting. We can study them now, but we just don't have a lot of granular knowledge about how Arabization happened in the past. So I want to I want to frame it in a way that maybe will bring out the differences, though, because I think that the case with Arabic was a bit different than the case with modern English. So one of the ways that we can do that is to look at how Al-Harith, the narrator, describes what it is that he's doing when he encounters Abu Zayd. I'm quoting now from the 19th century translation, where Al-Harith says that when he arrived in Morocco, this is one of the Maqamat, where he's traveled to the far west, as he calls it. And of course, he finds men gathered in a mosque discussing Arabic grammar, because this is what happens in every civilized city. And what he says is, I desire to converse with them for the sake of some maxim that might be acquired, or of scholarship that might be gotten in increase. The word that generally translate as maxim is kalima, literally a word. And when Abu Zayd, then what happens in the story is that the group is speaking, then they play a game where they have to produce palindromes, and they get stuck and they can't do it. And then Abu Zayd appears and produces many palindromes. So when he does that, Al-Harith says, wow, when he had bewitched us with his verses and fatigued us by the remoteness of his goals. And you see here the deficiency of a very literal translation. But what he means is that the guy did something amazing, and we praised him and paid him. So it's the search for a word and the response of wonder. Those are the elements I want to focus on. Now, if we look at that combination of elements, I think we can bring the Maqamat into relation with a model of knowledge that has parallels in late antique Christianity. So the same geographical world, roughly, where Al-Harith, where obviously Muslims are living, and also where Al-Hariri himself lived. So early Christianity, you have people like Saint Anthony going into the desert to meet Paul of Thebes. So you have the desert fathers living in isolation, and you go to them as a seeker, as a Christian seeker, and what you say to them when you find them is, give me a word. Give me a word. Or speak a word. Give me a word again. And when you get the word, which is a pithy distillation of some Christian precept, you marvel, you feel marvel, athavmasa, you are amazed, very much like Al-Harith. So I think as a general framework, the notion that one is going to a teacher to seek a word is very much operating even in the not post-Christian, but let's say in the mixed world of the diverse world of Christianity and Islam that characterizes Southwest Asia in this period. And what we find when you ask for a word and receive it and marvel at it is this sense that Stephen Greenblatt invokes when he talks about Shakespeare, is a pervasive sense that there is something uncanny about language, something that is not quite human. What it is you hope to achieve by the word is to be saved, as you saw in the first quotation. So there's something supernatural and salvific and numinous about language, even human language, because there's a spark in it of the divine. And that is something that is even more true in Islam than it is in Christianity, because after all, I don't think people claim that Koine Greek was actually the language of God, but Arabic was. As Sheldon Pollock has said about Sanskrit, I think it's even more true about Arabic. Arabic was the language of the gods in the world of men, but the language of the one God, that is, in the world of men. And is similar in that sense to Milton's fallen angel, Satan, where even after his rebellion and fall, Satan is still beautiful. So he's in hell, he's a ruined archangel, but His form had not yet lost all her original brightness, nor appeared less than archangel ruined and the excess of glory obscured. So human language, yes, is human language. We are fallible, we are human. But because God spoke Arabic when he revealed the Quran, when we speak Arabic, we are partaking of the divine. And this is something, I think, an element that one should keep in mind, because it's too easy to say that, well, people were learning Arabic for practical reasons in the same ways that we might learn English for practical reasons. So, of course, there were practical reasons, there's no question about it. But then what we're trying to reconstruct here partly is, what were the notion? How did people imagine what it is that they were doing? How did they imagine this enterprise? What was the, because to give up one's language and to sunder oneself from one's community in many ways is a difficult thing to do. And so there has to be a fairly strong, one might call it an ideological justification or rationalization for it. And I think that this is quite clearly part of it. Now, if we can go from the sublime to the ridiculous, what this means in practical terms, though, is this constant seeking for the unattainable. In other words, the fact that Abu Zayd is able to produce this kind of magical eloquence is something that Al-Harith finds endlessly fascinating. And he pursues him, as we've seen, from Basra to the Maghrib to Iran, always seeking this word, but he is never satisfied. He is never persuaded, he is never converted, he never weeps. The audiences of the sermons always weep, he never does. So there's a kind of Wile E. Coyote futility to the whole enterprise that comes through very clearly in the stories. Now, let's step back and look at this very literally. One could argue that the Maqamat themselves were actually used to teach people Arabic. Here's an example from a very early Istanbul manuscript, for which I thank Matthew, who very kindly shared it with me. And what this is showing you is what's in the brown ink is the actual text of Al-Hariri. And what's around it are someone scribbling words that either, these are corrections, glosses, additions. So for those who know Arabic, on the far left-hand side, you see 2 lines up from the bottom, there's the word thameen, and then, which means precious, and then someone has written in black, thameen and nafis. So saying that precious means valuable. So they're giving a synonym. And so one imagines that these may be native speakers who seek to broaden their stock of synonyms, or non-native learners of Arabic who are actually learning the language as they go. Now, the fact that there were actually non-natives learning from the Maqamat, as unlikely as that may seem given how difficult it was, we can actually see this from this manuscript, which is the earliest attestation of a Caspian language called Gilaki. And here we see, I know it's a very poor resolution image, but it's the text of Al-Hariri, and somebody has written under every single word the equivalent in Gilaki. So you can imagine people then sitting in a mosque, somebody reading the text, and then those who were desperately trying to learn Arabic are busily scribbling away in their own language, trying to learn this vocabulary on the premise that somehow they are partaking of the word by doing this. So although Hariri himself says that he's producing a kind of Arabic that's so difficult that it will actually teach something to native speakers, what happens is it becomes a kind of ideal standardized textbook where people are using it, I think, in some cases, out of all proportion to their actual ability in the language, which is why you have this kind of scribbling of synonyms, even of well-known words in different languages. Now, we don't know very much about, as I said, the granular process of how people learned Arabic. So I just want to share with you a few data points that I think may shed some light on it. I have the Arabic text there for those who know Arabic, but what I'm going to do here, I didn't want to get us too bogged down in analyzing these in any detail, so I'm simply going to summarize for you what these passages tell us. So in this passage, a very early Muslim legal thinker tells us that all Muslims should know Arabic because they require it for liturgical purposes. They need to be able to pronounce the testament of faith. They need to be able to pray. They need to understand the sermon and so on. So all Muslims, he says, should learn Arabic. Now, this may seem obvious to us. This may seem, well, but of course, I mean, that seems clear. But in fact, it wasn't always the norm. And I think Shafi'i in the 9th century actually had to argue it. He actually had to argue that new Muslims needed to learn Arabic, as if this were something that people hadn't necessarily accepted or thought about before. And then he goes on, which is a really interesting twist, and said, don't be discouraged if you're not a native speaker, because even native speakers don't know everything in Arabic. No one's knowledge is perfect. So as a non-native learner, you are on a continuum with native speakers. They are not categorically different from you. Now, how did acquisition actually take place? Well, one of the mistakes I think that we often make is to assume that it happened through learning and teaching, or accidentally. In other words, people picking up language from people around them. Well, as I think many of us know, either from experience or through being parents or whatever it may be, there is a window during which children can acquire languages to native ability. And I recently read an article saying that they've made that date very precise, and they say now it's 17.5 years old. Up to that age, you can acquire any language with native or near native proficiency. So it turns out that people in the 9th century knew that too. And in this case, this particular biography is of a singer called Ibrahim al-Mawsili. His parents were landowners in a particular region of Iran. And as landowners, they were middlemen between the Muslim Arab rulers and the peasantry. So they were involved in the process of resource extraction, tax collection, and so on behalf of the of the Umayyad government. At one point, it's not clear why, but they lose their position. The family travels to Kufa, and in Kufa, this little boy, Ibrahim, is born to a Zoroastrian Persian-speaking family who then put him in an elementary school with Arab children. And the result of it is that Ibrahim becomes a native speaker of Arabic and a Muslim. So there's no reference to conversion, and there's no reference to him having to learn Arabic as a second language. He is in effect bilingual in Persian and Arabic. And in fact, he was so good at them that he could sing in both of them and became a celebrity singer in Baghdad. And that's why we have this documentation, because otherwise nobody would have bothered to write this down. But he was such a famous figure that we accidentally have preserved this testimony about his childhood and how he learned Arabic through essentially just being dropped into a total immersion elementary school with Arab kids. Now, what about adults? As in the case with English and in the modern world, people found it amusing when adults try to learn a foreign language and essentially, because of some failure of proficiency, produce some kind of language that native speakers find funny. And this is a case of a hadith scholar from Iran who migrated to Baghdad. He was a very pious, ascetic figure. And he left his hometown, as many did, to come to Baghdad to hear hadith, to hear the traditions of the Prophet from scholars who knew it. But when he got there, he realized that his Arabic wasn't very good. And he had begun his life not in learned circles. He was actually a gangster. And so when he has a conversion experience, he comes to Baghdad, and he realizes he's never learned Arabic properly. So he goes to one of the leading grammarians, and he said, "Will you teach me Arabic?" And the grammarian says, "Yes." And then gives the sentence that is the equivalent of "see, spot, run," if you remember that from American school books, as a kind of paradigmatic grammatical sentence, "see, spot, run." And in Arabic, it's Zaid hit Umar. So you have a subject, object, verb, and that's kind of the way that they would teach grammar. So our hero hears the sentence, Zaid hit Amr. And he says, why did Zaid hit Amr? And the teacher says, no, 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 no. Nobody hit anybody. It's just an example. And our hero says, well, I'm not going to study any science that begins with a lie. So apart from the fact that, this story was told to emphasize how pious our hero is, it also tells us something about how you might acquire the language as an adult learner and the kinds of pitfalls that would occur when you try to do that. I'm going to mention this article by Claire Wilde, which deals with the question of how Christians learned Arabic. And one of the things that she talks about is that they seem to have tried to do it by reading the Quran, and Muslims didn't like it. And so she identifies a number of regulations against Christians hearing or touching the Quran as being grounded in the fact that they were trying to learn Arabic that way. A very interesting study. This is I think the earliest complete known tafsir, the exegesis of the Quran. And when I first looked at it, I was hoping to find really juicy early interpretation of the scripture. And it turns out that it's incredibly banal and simple-minded. It just says things. So for example, whenever it mentions the prophet, it says Muhammad, every time. And you start to think of yourself, what on earth could this possibly have been used for? And it suddenly struck me at some point that, well, this is the perfect language learning text. It fills in everything that's assumed. It restates everything in simple language, and it explains everything every time. So you can dip into it anywhere and everything is explained. And I thought, well, this has never been described in the literature then or now as a language learning text, but I suspect that that's either why it was written or why it was disseminated. And my last example is from a much later period, but we have so little testimony about these things that one has to dig pretty deep and range pretty far to find whatever data points one can. This is the author of a collection of witty anecdotes and poems, writing in Damascus in the early 15th century. And he describes himself as afflicted with a non-Arab manner of expression and a foreign accent, because he was a freedman from Central Asia. And we don't know exactly what his ethnicity was, but it's likely he was the native speaker of a Turkic language. And so he apologizes for, he says, I had to learn Arabic as a second language because I speak it funny. And on the question of accent, by the way, if anyone is interested, I've given the reference to an article by Geert-Jan van Gelder about accents. Two famous poets who, as non-native speakers, had accents and how that was received. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us anything about how they learned Arabic. But Zuli does. He goes on and says that the way you learn Arabic, and it's really interesting, he doesn't say the way you learn simple things. You go right to poetry, okay? And he says the way you do it is you start humming to yourself and chanting to yourself as you go about your daily chores. And you start reciting poems until you can feel the rhythm. So he's attuned to the notion that prosody is one of the hardest things to acquire as a non-native learner. And so eventually he says, you're going to resist it, but eventually something will click and it will come together. So he actually recommends, and this is something that I've heard several people tell me actually, who spoke English as foreigners with not just grammatical accuracy, but intonation. And I remember one person telling me that she learned that way because in the Netherlands, her teachers made her sing before she could speak. So she would sing in English, and then they would go back and analyze what she was singing. But the first step was to get the prosody of it. We also have evidence of incomplete learning, of people who made mistakes. And it's not clear whether these are native speakers who have now, whose normal speech has moved pretty far away from this written standard, or it's non-natives trying for a level of correctness that they don't actually have. But in this anecdote, a particular character wants to impress his friend who's a native speaker of Arabic, or a very accomplished speaker of Arabic, a very eloquent speaker. And so they're in the bathhouse, and our hero turns to his son and says, when you wash yourself, ibda biyadak wa rijlak, which is a grammatical error for ibda biyadaik wa rijlaik. So begin with your hands and your feet, but he puts the hands and the feet into the subject rather than the object case. And then to double down on the mistake, he turns to his Arab friend and he says, you know, people just don't speak as correctly as I do anymore. And his friend says, I don't think anybody speaks the way you do anymore. So again, information about how errors were perceived, but not a lot of good granular data on how language was acquired. Now, our friend who wrote the anthology, the one who had the Turkish accent apparently, is actually, we in a very rare case of eyewitness testimony, people tell us that this fellow Al-Ghazuli had all kinds of knowledge, but he was embarrassed actually to speak in public. So the Majlis is a kind of literary gathering, and so Ghazuli, it said, knew all kinds of poetry and anecdotes, but he would sit quietly in the gathering and never speak. And so the book, he actually presents the book later as a kind of, he'd been storing up all of this information for so long and he didn't feel secure or comfortable about reciting in public. So he puts it all into the book. Oh, we did that one, okay. So what is shared between what we can see from people's lived experience as language learners and the Maqamat? There's the shared element, there's the aspirational nature of language study, that somehow doing this will make me a better person. Doing this will, we can see that there are parents perceiving that they will increase their children's social mobility if they acquire Arabic at an early age. So there's that aspirational nature of it. There's this notion of membership in a cohort of like-minded men. And so many of the Maqamat illustrations show, so it's a gathering of men. Some of the sermons, we see the women as well, and they're gathered in a separate place. But the discussions on grammar are always in a cohort of like-minded men who are very competitive in the way they use Arabic and the way they talk about it. The experience of hearing a language that one understands only in part, as we saw from the manuscripts, people who read this book from beginning to end with a teacher often did not understand what they were hearing, and they had to scribble in these notes. And so I think the idea that it's what language teachers used to call comprehensible input. So you want something you teach people language by giving them texts that are authentic and pitched just above their level of proficiency. And so this seems to actually be one of the things that the Maqamat would do, is it would give them Arabic that was pitched at a level a little bit above where they were. And so when they heard it, they didn't always understand it. And that's something that comes through very clearly when people listen to Abu Zayd. The fear of embarrassment or humiliation. Al-Harith is often challenged to produce, a text without dots, or a text that rhymes in a certain way, or a text that's the same forwards and backwards, and he can never do it, and the other characters can never do it either, and they're always ashamed. And then when Abu Zayd does it, they respond with this wonder because he did the thing that they could not do. At least they're all ashamed together. And finally, this pursuit of the unattainable object. So especially as an adult learner, this notion of native proficiency is one that always recedes. And any of you who have tried to study any language know exactly what I'm talking about, right? No matter how good you get, no matter how good you were yesterday, no matter how much better you speak if you are with friends or you just had a beer or whatever it is that you do that makes it work, the very next day you can get busted right back to square one. And there's this sense in which this object is always receding from you. And so this then brings us back very precisely to this notion of language learning and the pursuit, especially of a language that has this numinous and divine quality to it, as this endless pursuit of an unattainable object. And this is something that's very well described in an article by Georgine Ayoub, who talks about Al-Arabiyya, the idealized language of the Quran, the idealized language of the Bedouin, the idealized language of early Islam, as something that grammarians always talk about as being a step away. It's not quite, the Beni Tamim don't quite do it, and the Quraysh don't quite do it, and the Beni Sa'd, yeah, they kind of did it, but then they stopped. It's always deferred. It's always a step away. It's never something that you can actually pin down. And in the cases when grammarians or philologists will actually drag a Bedouin into the court in Baghdad and ask him what the answer is, it never actually solves the problem. There are as many arguments about what the Bedouin said as they began with. And so I think she's very much, she's put her finger on something that's quite salient in the way language is discussed in early Arabic literature. And finally, there is a kind of a correlation or parallelism between the fact that characters in the Maqamat, in the impostures, are constantly traveling from one place to another, from one city to another, never attaining their object, but always seeking the word. And a really apt characterization of that phenomenon comes from a book by Michael Rand on actually the Hebrew Maqamat. There are translations of Al-Hariri into Hebrew and then original Maqamat written in Hebrew as well. And in discussing those, Rand talks about, well, why is it always in a different city? You know, why do the characters always meet in a different place? And he says that the function of those names is not to chart a route, but to create a general sense of motion and restlessness. So the imposture form, the maqama form, is suited for representing movement as such, not telic movement from a starting point to an end. So very much the same way that learning a language, even one's own language, is not a process that one feels that one has ever actually complete, right? And that is metaphorized or made figurative in the maqamat by this plot device of constant motion. So I think I will simply stop there with this image of the unattainable pursuit. And I could certainly say more about some of the ways in which that works out historically, but I think also if anyone is interested in how it is that one goes about translating a book that's all about, in a sense, inimitability, I'd be happy as well to talk about the translation. But for now, I think I'll turn it back to the audience for discussion. Oops, I didn't mean to do that, but we can come back to it if we need to. So I hope I didn't go on too long. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all, Dr. Cooperson. Thank you so much for that excellent lecture. And I'm sorry we can't all, we're clapping on the screen. So, and wonderful slides as well. We have quite a few questions showing up via chat, but I wanted to take advantage of my position as moderator to ask a question as well. Now, one thing that I find interesting is that Arabic language and this notion of a pure ideal Arabic language is not necessarily religiously without problems, because when we think about where Arabic formed, it's in the Jahiliyyah, right? And the ideal poetry of Arabic is not just in the Quran, it's in this place before Islam arrived. And we also see that the people that are teaching the ideal desert Arabic, the Bedouin, are not always the best Muslims, and often are not. And in the time of Al-Hariri, we have, and just before Al-Hariri, we had the Karamita, the Karmathans, right, who were the Bedouin, who actually stole the black stone of the Kaaba and moved it to the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. So if these are the ideal Arabic speakers, right, they have all these problems associated with them as well. What about that tension do you think is also being expressed here?
It's a great point, and I think you actually complimented Georgine's insight, because I think perhaps for the reasons that you raise, this is one of the reasons that Arabic never ends up actually being definitively associated with anybody, right? Because you can say, look at the Qarmatis, and you can say, well, you know, the thing about the Qarmatis is they really don't pronounce the ayn correctly, or whatever it might be, right? There's always some objection, right? There's always some objection. And the work of Ahmed al-Jallad, who is, God bless him, I mean, he's putting up all of his work immediately on academia. He has shown very definitively that this notion that the perfect Arabic actually existed in the past is also a construction, in that he's got cases where we have early Arabic that happen to get written down in Greek script. So you have Greek speakers saying, oh, these people are talking about, Amir al-Mu'mineen. So they try to write Amir al-Mu'mineen in Greek script. And from that, he's able to show that many of the features that we call dialect or vernacular or colloquial actually existed in the Jahiliyyah, right? Yeah. And so, and Sibawayh says this too in the 8th, 9th centuries, that such and such a tribe doesn't agree their verbs properly. This other tribe can't pronounce dad, right? So nobody ever gets to actually definitively be the perfect speaker of Arabic, right? There's some discussion about how it is that the Prophet, there's a khabar that says that the Prophet had to be sent to the Bani Sa'd as a child to learn.
Yes.
Right? So it keeps moving around. It's a moving target, right? Which is where the roadrunner comes from. So yes, absolutely. It's a tension between Arabic as a language and Islam as a religion, and I think that it was a productive tension and just kept getting negotiated, and it was never resolved, and still isn't resolved really.
And it's interesting how the Prophet's teacher of language was actually a woman, right? Because he goes to the nurse mother of the Bedouin, but that's another discussion. Diana, you have some questions from the chat. Do you want to choose one and get
Sure. We have lots of questions coming in. So one of the first ones is, I am curious if Christian translators in the 12th century felt the same about Latin, or if they adopted some form of respect for Arabic in a way that they did not regarding Latin, or if the Christian scholars simply dismissed the notion of Arabic as the language of God.
That is a fantastic question, and I don't know the answer. All I can tell you is I've done a very little bit of research on the reception of the Maqamat in Europe in the early modern period. And what you find there, and these are Dutch scholars writing in Latin, and what they all say is Al-Hariri is the Arabic Cicero, and his language is rhythmical in a way and rhymed in a way that we cannot reproduce in Latin. So they would never acknowledge Arabic as being a legitimate vehicle of divine revelation, right? But what they do say is that, so they try to domesticate him by Romanizing him. And they say, well, Hariri is to Arabic as Cicero is to Latin. So again, it's like a pagan non-believer, right? But acceptable as a paragon of language. And we can't reproduce this eloquence in Latin. So it's actually, to Alan's point, it's again saying that, the eloquence happens among pagans too. That doesn't make their language a divine language, it just means that they're really eloquent and we can't quite manage that in Latin. But as to your specific question with the Andalus, I really don't know. It's a great question and I hope you research it.
Okay, Alan, I think you're on mute. Did you want to ask the next question?
I have a question from one of my graduate students. How do we combat our own presentism when evaluating literature as a primary source? Sorry, it's a history question, Michael.
Why did you have to answer it?
How should we account for different critical interpretations from different periods of time?
Well, I think the answer for me, and I don't make any claims about methodological originality or brilliance here, but a lot of scholarship on the Maqamat is a bit literalist in that it says, the stories are based on a real guy who, was a refugee from the Crusaders, which is how Abu Zayd presents himself, and tries to look at things like, it's been argued by some of the best scholars on the Maqamat that what we're seeing here is a move of eloquent people away from secretarial jobs into a kind of, PhDs driving Ubers. That kind of a world where they can't count on income from the conventional sources that sustained learned culture. And so they're doing other kinds of things. And some of them become itinerant preachers or secretaries looking for work or reduced to performing on the street, performing poetry and so on. So people have tried to ground historically in that way. And what you hit eventually is just a kind of lack of evidence. It's very hard to prove any of those things. So what I've tried to do here in a talk like this is to think of it more metaphorically. So when I say that the Maqamat preserve a memory of Arabization, I guess what I mean is that they only slightly preserve the actual mechanics of it. I think when you see the Gilaki being scribbled on the manuscript, that's pretty solid, concrete evidence that some non-native speaker was using this text as a textbook, right? But there's not much of that. I mean, what can we learn beyond that? I like to think of it more as a metaphor, that the notion of language learning as a quest becomes part of the mental furniture of people in the past. Whether that is a valid or interesting historical conclusion, I don't know. But I think it's the only way to make literature and history talk to each other without this kind of simple-minded over-literalization of everything. I don't think you can really dig through, you can really dig through these books and find anything terribly useful about, prices or commodities or movement. I mean, there's not much hard data there. And so it has to kind of go to metaphor, and and I don't know if that's satisfying, but to me it does resonate with some of the testimonies that we have about people learning the language, and so I think I hope it holds together.
There's also a lot that can be said about culture and diversity as well in this book, and that's something that you really bring out in your translation, Michael, is that he takes each of the Maqamat and shows it in a different style, a different language of English, or a different form of English. You have Singaporean English, you have Australian, you have all these different manifestations that show that diversity, and the same sort of diversity existed in Al-Hariri's Basra that he was writing in. So that's really interesting. Now, Diana, was it your turn to ask the next question?
Sure, I'll take the next one. This one is, what was the fallout on Arabic and the literary works of Arabic from the Mongol destruction of the House of Wisdom? Does it make it any harder today to study Arabic in a historical context?
Great question. So there's a book by Dimitri Gutas called Greek, what is it called? Greek Science, Arabic Culture, maybe, or Greek Knowledge, Arabic Culture.
Greek Thought, Culture.
Greek, what?
حبيبي.
حبيبي. أهلا وسهلا. Oh my goodness. Awad was the great star of UCLA who went to Georgia and became, I guess, an even bigger star. But we miss you.
جمعا القلوب عند بعض حبيبي.
والله وحشتنا حبيبي وحشتنا. Thank you so much for coming. So this book, Gutas's book, actually digs into this question of the House of Wisdom. And what he concludes is that there are about 9 references to it in all of Arabic literature, and they're all very abbreviated. They say things like, so-and-so was the head of it, or Hunayn worked there. And there's not really much beyond that. And modern nationalist historians have taken this and built on it this huge edifice of speculation about the House of Wisdom as this great academy, a library, a translation school. It may well have been some of those things, but we simply don't know. And in any event, even if it was a very prominent part of the landscape in early Abbasid Baghdad, by the time the Mongols arrived, now we're talking 4 centuries later, and so whatever the House of Wisdom may have been once, it certainly wasn't still doing that then. Legend has it that, that when the Mongols came, they destroyed Baghdad and destroyed all the books and all of that. I would say that probably more important as a factor for why we just don't have many books from the early period is that there was a very competitive and commercialized culture of book production, which is something that Shaka Turawa has written about, and others. And part of that is that you would try to write books that would make other books obsolete. So Tabari's history, for example, quotes many other histories, almost none of which survive. Because why? Once you have Tabari, you no longer need the 17 other pre-Tabari historians, or at least people didn't think they did, right? And certain interpretations become orthodox, certain become favored, and so there's a huge falling away of older books. And so by the time you get to the 13th century, I don't know even whether in Baghdad itself you could have found, a pristine early copy of, the memoirs of Saif bin Umar or whoever it might be. I think it was already subsumed into other books that have survived. So it's not as bad as it seems. The situation is actually not as catastrophic as you might imagine. which is, I mean, it's still heartbreaking when you look at catalogs of books in the 10th century and how many are lost. I mean, it's enormous. And this is something that Devin has written about. But still, I don't think that it was really a matter of destroying one library or one single invasion. There were a lot of other factors.
Great. I have another question for you, Michael. The idea of searching for a word, going back to the beginning of your lecture, does that apply to literally looking for a word to satisfy some conditions? Is it the word or God, or is it just a substitute meant to represent something more? And so just to add to that, is there a difference between the Gospel of John's notion of the word as God and the Islamic notion of the word as God, or are they identical or nearly the same?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thought that comes to mind is the word was with God and the word was God. I think what Al-Hariri discovers in the course of the Maqamat is that the word is not God. That for a Muslim, the word is not God. And this is a particular point of debate in theology, I mean, among the Mu'tazila and the Sunnah, that, I mean, there was debate over whether the Quran is itself a manifestation of the divine, or whether it's just our human transcript of God's words, right? So there were debates over whether, you know, if I recite Iqra, is my word created or uncreated, right? If you think of it as produced by me, it's created, right? Because I'm created. But if you think of it as I am actually instantiating God's word, that he's actually saying the word, then it's uncreated, right? And so this was a matter of debate. And I think, you know, Al-Hariri is interested in many things. Theology is not one of them. He never talks about it. He doesn't say a word about theology anywhere. So it's hard to make him a theologian, but I think that, and this goes into the realm of interpretation of transculturation. I don't think this would make any sense to him, but I think that as a present day reader, it's impossible not to see these resonances. And if you're familiar with the Christian tradition, you of course think of the word, and I think from a Christian perspective, what Al-Harith is learning is that the word isn't God. That there's God, and then there's language, and Abu Zayd is a kind of false prophet or some kind of perversion of that divine language, but you're not going to get to God through rhetoric. You're not going to get to God through grammar. You're not going to get to God directly through any kind of interaction with this flawed, eloquent but flawed human being. And so I think that there was a kind of the Christian framework is relevant and operative without necessarily leading to the same place in the end.
Okay, we have another one about your process of translating. I'm curious what the process of translating a text, which was meant to show off what Arabic can do, into a different language is like. How do you translate a text like that into a different language in a way which is true to the original text, in a way that conveys the original language as well as possible?
Thank you for asking the question. I will share my screen again, if I may do that, and tell you briefly how I did that. So the short version is that I discovered something called the Ulipo, which is a group of mid-20th century, I mean, it still exists as a group, but the people I was interested in are the mid-20th century practitioners of the Ulipo movement. And the person that I found to be extremely helpful in trying to translate Hariri is Raymond Queneau, who wrote a book called Exercice de Style. And in it, he tells the same pointless short story 99 different styles. So one of them is spoken by a person who's angry at everyone. Another is spoken by a person who has an English accent in French. Another is a person who has I think it's a West Indian accent or a Caribbean accent. Some of them are mathematical manipulations of letters, and it's all very Haririan. So I took that as a way as a formal constraint. So I said, all right, if Abu Zayd is mutable and changeable and appears in every episode in a different city, that variety can be replicated by having each of the maqamat translated into a different style. And so that way I tried to show off what English can do. The result is this. So here are the 50, this is not the, I mean, this is the table of contents, essentially, not from the book, but this is the contents. And here you see there are 50 episodes, and each of them is in a different style. There are 3 kinds of styles. So there are literary figures. So I have Mark Twain, I have Boswell, Johnson, Virginia Woolf, Gilbert and Sullivan, and so on. And some who are actually quite obscure, but I needed them for a particular reason. Each style is chosen based on a theme in the Maqamat. So there are the literary styles. Then there are the historical ones. So in other words, and sometimes, you know, somebody is both. So Marjorie Kemp, number 50, was a medieval English mystic. So it's in her style, but it's also in Middle English. So that one is historical and literary. Some are jargons, like thieves. There's a guy who, the police chief of New York in the 19th century, wrote a dictionary of thieves jargon, which was used in the film Gangs of New York. That's how Daniel Day-Lewis speaks, and he does a fantastic job. So I kind of binge watched that movie, and then that one is number 7. And then finally, there are different global Englishes. So Australian, the ones that Alan mentioned. So, you know, Australian and Irish and Scottish and different ones. So that's how I did it. And the choice was always based on a theme. So when they go to Morocco, for example, when Al-Hariri goes to Morocco and finds Abu Zayd there, I thought about, okay, the far west. It's the far west. He calls it Aqsa al-Maghrib. So what is the furthest western kind of English? Well, depends where you start, of course. Depends where you're counting from. But if we leave out, say, like Hawaiian or whatever, it depends where you count. But Spanglish, all right, it's Southwestern English, and there are different kinds, obviously. So here's just an example of number, which one is it? 16, which is in Spanglish. So what's happening here is this is the challenge of the palindromes. And so the people are speaking Spanglish, and they challenge Abu Zayd to come up with a palindrome. And he does one in Spanish earlier, but then he does one in English. And so where he says, me, definitely, let in, I fed him. If you read that backwards, it's all the same letters, right? That was the thing he had to do, the difficult thing. And then they say, and then he says, I'll top it with one where every line is a palindrome. And then here's the poem. And this poem is not in Spanglish, it's in Standard English, because every Spanglish speaker I know in Southern California is bilingual. I mean, they speak English and they speak Spanish, and they alternate between them based on the context. And so in this case, this is a challenge in formal Arabic, so I made the poem formal Arabic. So this is an example of the kind of thing that I tried to do. I can show you others if you're interested, but then I would have to actually, I can leave the show and then actually like go to my PDF and show you any other one you're interested in seeing. So that should give you a sense of the approach anyway.
Well, unfortunately, we are nearing the end of the time that Michael has generously provided us to tell us about his remarkable achievement here. And just looking at that palindrome, that must have taken ages. Just that one little poem. And you still make them, you still express what Al-Hariri is trying to express, both in spirit and literally too. So it's remarkable achievement, Michael. And it's an honor to have you here. And I encourage all of you to learn more about imposters, maybe pick it up. And incidentally, for those of you in my Middle East history class, you're all here, the Muqaddimah has a nice section at the end on language learning and what it's like to learn language as a non-Arab speaker. So,
yes, I should have cited that. Oh my gosh, yes.
So that's something maybe if you're interested in that, that could be something you write about for your final paper. Okay. So you have been very useful, Michael.
Let me just interject and make a request that we save the chat, and any questions that are in the chat, I will try to answer if you put your email or leave some identifier there. I will try to. I've been I've done other talks where I've actually been able to go into the chat and find everybody and answer their questions, even if I didn't get to it in person. So please, if you wrote a question that you would like to see answered, and I love the questions. I love reading people's questions. You can put your personal email in there or some way to find you, and I will try to answer if I can.
Thank you so much. You're extremely generous with us, Dr. Cooperson. I want to thank all of the participants as well, and all of your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And I look forward to seeing you at our next lecture and our next event. So thank you so much, everyone, and I will see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
ألف شكر أستاذ، مع السلامة.
مع السلامة.